Day 4 of IFA 2014 Mumbai Congress. Three hot topics which are relevant even in India's context today. BEPS, difference between UN and OECD, and intangibles. Very hot topics, and I will first deal with some of the key takeaways from the session that just got concluded is on the new work that United Nations is proposing to do on the services. A proposed introduction of new Article 12 as they call it, for taxation of the services. In just about a couple of weeks in Geneva, UN is going to discuss the contours of how this new article is going to be. And very interesting to hear Shefali during the discussion, Mrs. Anita Kapoor from CBDT India, she put forth her suggestions on how this article should be. A couple of highlights that there should not be a condition for rendition of the service in a source country. The definition of service should be broad, and the taxation rate for royalty and service should be the same, so that the classification dispute do not arise. Completely contrary to that, however, was a view from ICC representative who is also head of tax at Siemens, and he suggested that the nexus-based theory to tax services should be continued. In other words, there should be an actual physical provision of service in a source jurisdiction to be able to tax it. Though he interestingly agreed to the gross basis of taxation as a suggestion, but with a rate not exceeding 3%. Any quick comment, Shefali, on this important change that is going to take place at UN?
So this is a debate which has been going on for some time. On the taxation of services, India's position has always been that for us it doesn't matter where the services are rendered. And India has always also taxed services on gross basis. Considering that our domestic law definition of services is very broad, almost all services do get captured in that. Most countries do have a problem with that, which is why even if UN goes ahead and recommends one model clause for the taxation of services, I see that it will not be easily accepted by most countries, because this is in practice going to shift the taxation from the residence countries to the source countries. And once you start taxing the services on gross basis, it does not take into account the profitability of the companies or those activities. And we know that there are challenges around the tax credits, which essentially means that once the countries agree to the gross level of tax on the services, it is going to result in higher taxation for them. So there are going to be challenges, but we will look forward to seeing what UN proposes.
Right. The day started today with the topic of the year, if I can say, BEPS. I think, Shefali, if somebody would have counted the use of how many times word BEPS has been used, it must be over 1 million times perhaps in last 3-4 days. But yeah, that's an important topic, and we had representatives from OECD discussing the work done on BEPS so far. And particularly in focus was the report on the treaty abuse. And very interestingly, a representative from New Zealand Revenue who is in charge of this particular report was present, and very interesting how they sort of put forth their perspective. One of the key concerns raised under this treaty abuse is the US-style limitation of benefits clause, LOB, which OECD is now proposing to introduce. And one of the key aspects of this LOB is the principal purpose test, PPT. And how easy is it going to be to sort of administer this? Because it does give a lot of discretion to the tax department officer to sort of decide whether the principal purpose test is applicable or not. And so this is a very interesting debate that we will enter, and clearly the views were divided on this aspect. Shefali, any perspective on this principal purpose test, substance? We've been hearing these different terms which essentially have the same meaning to the core, but will have an impact.
That's right, and there is a lot more focus on the LOB now, and most of the Indian recent treaties also have LOB in the tax treaties, which is going to now more and more restrict the eligibility of foreign companies to take the treaty benefit. The bigger challenge has been that the longer the clauses and more explanations and exceptions, it is going to be more and more complicated to read and interpret the treaties. It also means that there will be a lot more uncertainty because the companies will not know upfront as to whether or not they would qualify for the treaty benefits. So of course for the straightforward cases there will be a treaty entitlement, but the minute you have a different jurisdiction introduced in your structure, you wouldn't know till much later as to whether or not you are going to be granted the advantage of the treaty in the source country. So this will create more challenges for the companies. It will also create more challenges to the payers, because at the time of making the payment, should they withhold tax based on the treaty entitlement or not? Because more likely than not, that the payers may not have full visibility as to the structures. And since the different countries have different approaches, including the local general anti-avoidance rule, it is likely to be more and more complex on how the treaty entitlement would be given to the foreign companies. But you're right, the principal purpose test is the new buzzword, and we will all have to get used to that.
Right. One quick comment, Shefali, around BEPS. Whatever we've been hearing here in Congress, people from 50 countries, different stakeholders who've been expressing views for and against BEPS. Indian revenue, which has been sort of proposing, or their thoughts in a sense have been partly endorsed in the BEPS proposals essentially. Do you think they would be vindicated to hear what the panelists discussed today in the BEPS session?
I don't know whether you just ascribe this to the Indian revenue, because collectively if you see countries like Brazil, China, India, Russia, they are all coming from a similar perspective. So essentially whatever is being seen in these early days of BEPS final recommendations is more a result of taking into account the recommendations put forth by some of these countries. But this is a classic debate, and I don't see this ending or coming to a conclusion anytime soon, because it is quite clear that the other countries are not going to be so agreeable to the positions which are being expressed in the early BEPS action plans.
Right.
So we will see more and more debate on it, and ultimately only once all the countries agree to it and there is a multilateral instrument or a bilateral amendment of the treaty that we will see these BEPS actions being put in practice.
Right. Intangible is another hot topic, and that was a topic of discussion today. Did you feel that after listening to the panel, there is a consensus on what will happen on intangible? Any key takeaways from this session, Shefali?
So mainly the panel discussed on the OECD report on the intangibles and how broadly the intangibles are defined, and it is defined in the negative instead. So it does leave out a lot open for interpretation, and there was discussion on the location savings and the location advantages as well. There is a lot more work that still needs to be done on many of these aspects, but it does sound like many of the concerns that India, China and Brazil had raised are coming out, because the UN report on the intangibles clearly included the comments from all of these countries. So it is a challenging situation, but at least there is a lot more material now and a lot of examples through which they have tried to explain how they would tax some of these intangibles.
Okay. On intangibles and specifically on location saving, one very interesting comment came on the services panel is that, well, look, you say that you have a location specific advantage in terms of the market, but do look at a country like Germany. The panelists said that we also have a location advantage in terms of sophisticated infrastructure. Same applies to US. US actually today is also one of the largest consumer market economies. So when the companies from developing countries start going outside, all of the concerns that developing economies expressing are today would become relevant even for their businesses or their the companies operating in their jurisdiction. Any quick comment on this?
But eventually, isn't it all relative, right? Because there are several factors all demanding the profit attribution to those functions. And while developing countries would have some of the factors, and the developed countries will have some other factors. Now, how will you then go about allocating profits amongst these factors? How much weightage will you give to each one? That will be the real key, and that's the whole transfer pricing adjustment about. So once we have more clarity and more consensus on that, only then we will be able to sort out this issue. Otherwise, if the outsourcing service provider countries, if they keep demanding a higher share of the cost savings on account of the the location advantages. Over a period of time, it will start getting reduced.
Right.
So we'll have to see how it goes, but it doesn't look very promising at this point.
Okay, thanks Shefali, thanks so much for your
Thank you.
comments. So this brings us to the end of fourth day coverage. Tomorrow is the last day of IFA Congress. Some of the interesting technical sessions continue, and Shefali, look forward to your comments tomorrow as well.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.